let's start with each of you maybe describing your journey as Indian Americans in the United States. What has that been like? What have been the challenges, and what's helped move you ahead?
I'm a first-generation immigrant. I came to Texas when I was 21 years old to go to graduate school at Texas A&M, and as some folks say, I never left. Um, you know, I did not come here with $6 in my pocket. I grew up fairly privileged. My parents thought that education was the single biggest and best inheritance that they could give me. So I'd read about schools, I'd read about what life in the US was like, watched movies about it, and I got to come here to experience some of it. Civic engagement was always a big part of my undergraduate life. So I continued that both in College Station and subsequently in Houston. There was the usual set of challenges, making ends meet, finding a campus job, driving a $300 car with the front and rear fender tight to the car to prevent it from falling off. But probably the single biggest challenge in some ways was the immigration system, because it was unreliable. You couldn't really depend on which way it was going. It was uncertain. It was certainly something you couldn't control on your own. And unfortunately, I think in the last 30 years, it's probably gotten more uncertain in spite of valiant efforts on comprehensive immigration reform, which continues to remain elusive. I would say there were a couple of amusing things that happened to me when I first got here. Most folks assumed that I was a green card holder. And when I opened my mouth, it was pretty obvious that I was not. So the very next default was that I was an alien, and in some cases, an illegal alien, neither of which was amusing, certainly not now. The other thing was that folks were interested that I could actually speak in English. And when I told them that English was the only language that I could read, write, speak, yes, with an accent, still today, but also think in, which I thought was a significant advantage. So, the how do you move ahead part of the question might sound cliche. It was a determination to work hard like your life depended on it, because frankly, my life and my future did depend on it. And here we are, almost 30 years later.
So I was born on the south side of Chicago. I am the daughter of immigrants who came here to study, and after they were married. And so my mother came here as a new bride to someone that she had spent very little time with. And their journey is, I think, very much like many who came after the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, which is that they came as professionals who wanted to make a better life in the United States. And so my journey is one that is unique in a number of different ways, because I think I grew up in the city. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, which is a predominantly African-American community. And I grew up in a place where the focus was really on, it was not so much on the fact that I was an Indian American, but it was more on the fact that I was part of a community in which education, trying to figure out how it is that we build a community and help people learn about who we were. And so I spent a lot of my time growing up having people coming over and learning about what it meant to be a young person who was the daughter of immigrants from India. People came over and my mom cooked, and we had celebrations of Indian holidays that were people from every background you could imagine. And so that has been my experience of being Indian American, is that it's been a place where I feel like we've really been able to share who we are, what our background is, what our traditions are, with people who can learn about that and have that be very much part of what they think America is.
I grew up in South Bend, Indiana, and my siblings and I would joke that my parents looked at a map and saw India and Indiana and thought that's where we needed to go. And I assure you, India and Indiana have nothing in common. But growing up in the 70s and 80s in South Bend, Indiana, it was predominantly white. To survive in that culture at the time, I had to pretend to be white. I subconsciously did it, and then at some point, I think I rationalized by doing that. But in order to fit in, you have to assimilate into what that community was like. So for me, I was pretending that I was white to be able to get through school and to go to parties and to feel like I belonged to a community. But along the way, at some point, that backfires on you. And I remember distinctly the moment that happened. I was at Notre Dame, and my entire family was at the Basilica on the University of Notre Dame campus for Easter Mass. And to go to Easter Mass on that campus, you have to get there hours early because it's packed. So we're sitting there, and my dad had just come he was recovering from kidney cancer surgery. So we got our seats and we sat there for a few hours waiting for Mass to start. A few minutes before Mass starts, a group of white seminarians come up and they say that we have to move. It's a packed church, there's nowhere to move. So we had to leave. And before I left, I remember looking around the Basilica and I saw all of these white families. But why did they come and ask us? And I could see the pain and the hurt on my parents' face, but they did not want to make a scene. They didn't want to make an issue of it. They just got up and we all walked out. But maybe it was a sign from God that it was at that moment where I realized that I was going to prove that we as Pullapillys deserved a seat at the table.
Anurima, let me follow up with you and then invite Sanjay to answer as well. But you started to touch on this a little bit, I think, when you were describing growing up in Chicago. Would you talk about how you define your own identity and how you arrived at this identity?
I think our identity is created, it's built, it's developed by experience. And so my identity is one that has changed as I've had many different types of experiences. And so I have been, as I mentioned, a child of the South Side, which means I knew a bit about hip hop and about risotto. And I've been someone who grew up and spent my time as a civil rights lawyer. I am someone who also thinks of myself as being a community builder that understands that the ways in which we can come together in the U.S. Is one where we're the more diversity, the more sort of voices, the more people who we can have that like smash together from different creative backgrounds, from being civil rights lawyers, from being activists, from being those who just bring very different kinds of perspectives. That's been my identity, as someone who wants to be standing at the intersections, because I think that's where the magic happens for so much of the ways in which we can learn from one another and find new ways to forge ahead. So that's very much been the way in which my identities have been created and changed over time. And so I don't think that they are static. I think that they are dynamic, they're ever moving, and they reflect the ground and the soil that we're standing in at any given moment, and are what helps us to actually plant roots and have those roots grow in different ways. Is to really think about how depending on what we're standing next to, depending on what's going next to us, that's the way in which our identities can be infused and changed and frankly grow differently. So that's kind of the magic of how I think about identity, is that it hasn't been something that has been static. It's been something that's grown and is enriched by the experience that I'm having.
Sanjay, how would you feel about your own identity? How would you describe it? How would you define it? And how do you think you arrived there?
So I would say mine is very similar to what Anurima just said. It's shaped by life experiences. It's also shaped by my roots, which I'm incredibly proud of. I grew up in a small mining town in southern India, small by Indian standards, 300,000 people. And now I live in the fourth largest city in the United States, arguably the most diversity in the United States. So, and it's evolved over time. That identity has changed over time. And I'm an infrastructure professional. I've heard from my parents that as a little baby, I really liked being wheeled to the neighborhood bus station. And all I wanted to do when I grew up was to become a bus driver. And today I sit on the board of the Metropolitan Transit Authority of Harris County, Houston, still shaping transportation policy. I'm an engineer by profession. I get to see things built, and it's pretty satisfying. So if you ask me what my identity is today, it is that of a proud Indian American that is an engaged, informed citizen that is active in the civic business and to some extent in the political space as well. But to this day, I mean, I've lived most of my adult life in Texas, 29 years now. So when somebody asks me, where are you from? My answer is typically, I'm from Houston, Texas. 9 out of 10 times, that question is followed with, no, where are you really from? Of course, then I got to explain that. What I mean to say is right, wrong, or indifferent. In many ways, our identities get defined for us. Not that it's right, not that I should accept it, but it happens, right? It's if anything that the last 4 years have taught us, it's that words matter. We've got to take them seriously. We got to take them literally. And I grew up, I first came to Texas, and I was most commonly referred to as an alien. And some of my friends will tell you this, my preferred attire when it comes to shoes is cowboy boots today. I wear an Aggie ring. I get to participate in organizations like the Texas Lyceum, which is all about civil discourse. So, all of these things shape you, how you've changed. And that, to me, is part of the beauty of being an American, right? It allows you to be whoever you want to be, depending on what stage in life you are, and all that you want to be, whenever you want to be.
Something that Sanjay said triggered a thought for me, and it's about whether or not identities are forged upon us, and in many ways, I do think that part of the freedom of being American is that we are able to forge our own identities. So how we think about our identity, to me, is a choice. It's an act, and that's what I meant by the fact that it's not static. It's not where are you from. It's where are you standing, and where do you want to go. And in some ways, the process, the act of redefinition, of being able to be open to actually subsuming all these other identities, I think is such an important part of what I think it is to be an American.
Indian parents are a lot of times in survival mode, right? When they come to America, they want to get educated, they want a good job, and they want to take care of their families. But for Indian American children, we are in success mode. Our success validates their sacrifices. So for me personally, my family was always a family of service. My parents were educators, my brother's an ICU doctor, my sister is the director of the Peace Corps for East Timor. But I had to use my skill sets to try to figure out where I fit within the family mission of service. So for me, that was through journalism. I became a journalist, then I moved into documentary filmmaking, and then I realized I found my niche really tackling social issues, but telling them in commercial and entertaining films.
So how do we create a common national identity while at the same time people maintaining some of their own particular ethnic, social, or cultural identity? How do you combine those two?
So I think in many ways, having a common national identity is having multiple ethnic, cultural, religious, racial identities. I think that is what the common American identity is the fact that it is a place where we've been able over centuries, right, to have people bring the things that make them unique and different and special, and find something common within that. And that is what I think we have been talking about this week as we forge a different chapter in American history, where it is about what we have in common. And in so many ways, the idea of a common American identity too is something that is also forged, and it's changed and it's redefined. And I think in so many ways, what we're seeing right now is the way in which it's being forged and redefined in a way that is allowing for so many of those different identities to come through. The kind of rhetoric and frankly hate that we have been seeing is one that I think comes from the idea that there is only one American identity, and that is one that is that the idea that multiculturalism is not part of America's history belies the fact that it has been since its founding, and that And that in many ways, the hate that we're seeing is the thought that those who come from different identities, at least some of them, not all of them, if they're Black or they're brown, that somehow or another they're not part of the common American identity. And I think that is entirely wrong, because the common American identity is not that someone is white. It's not that they're from a particular religious background. It's that they have come here and they've actually tried to forge community, and they've had to try to forge something really different about how we can build a nation that actually celebrates those different identities that people bring, not denigrate or suggest that that's not part of America.
I remember growing up in the 80s, there was a big campaign that was called Made in America. I don't know if you guys remember that at all, but it was, essence of it was Buy American. And my mom loved this concept. In growing up in South Bend, she would search out everything. We couldn't buy clothes unless we looked at the label and we proved to her that it was made in America. And it really made us proud to be Americans, because we felt like we were doing our duty. Even though we were shopping, we were still doing our duty. But what I realized is that component, that idea still exists today, where what it really means is buy from Black businesses, Latino businesses, Asian businesses, white businesses, support your community the way you can. And that is being American. So you can hold that national identity, but also support the culture within. I live in Los Angeles. This is as global as you can get of a society, but we are all proud to be Americans here. And I get to explore and appreciate the cultures of this world right in my little city of Los Angeles. And I say city as a joke.
It doesn't have to be one or the other. You can have a national identity and maintain your individual cultural identities as well. What is it that makes us American? In my mind, that is a long list of values: freedom, democracy, respect for others, honor. You can go on and on. And to me, it's a we the people. And by that, I mean the multicultural, pluralistic society with the diversity of talent, thoughts, perspectives. That's what gives us the national identity. That's what makes us a great nation in my mind. If you go back to what Reagan said, right, it's that continuous influx of immigrants is what keeps America forever young. As I get close to a milestone in my life, I like the idea of the forever young. With the exception of Native Americans, most of us, or in fact, all of us, are immigrants. It's just that some of our ancestors came here a whole lot earlier than others. My kids' parents were the ones that came here. Anurima's parents were the ones that came here, but to a lot of folks, they came here a whole lot earlier. And I think some of this conversation today that we keep hearing about somehow recent immigrants are not as American or as patriotic. I think that's troubling for the concept of a nation and the national identity. For decades, for centuries probably, we've been celebrating St. Patrick's Day. We all revel in it. Today, we also celebrate the Indian Festival of Lights or Festival of Colors, Diwali, Holi. And all of that adds to our national identity. It doesn't take away from it. To me, it actually enriches it even further.
Let me follow up with you all on this one, and we'll start with you, Sanjay, since you were just talking about this. So how do you do that? How do people living in free societies maintain the type of identity, common identity that you're talking about, without weaponizing their own religious, ethnic, or national identity against someone else?
So I think it all starts with basic courtesy, respect, understanding of each other as fellow Americans, as fellow human beings. I mean, that's a fundamental starting point for all of this, right? And I'm not just talking understanding where somebody's coming from. I'm not talking about geography. I'm not talking about ethnicity. I'm also talking about people's life circumstances. In the absence of that basic courtesy and respect, nothing happens. But I might push back a little bit on that. In order to enjoy the benefits of free society, one has to weaponize. It is not necessary. Granted, it happens. This may get controversial, but all religions have their fair set of bad actors. But labeling the entire group as being that way is not helpful to anybody. in some ways, to me, why does weaponization even happen? It's because people feel isolated. People don't think they have opportunity. And frankly, sometimes it's because people feel like they're losing their privilege or their power. So I think it is incumbent on all of us that live in free society to make sure that we are tapping into the diversity of perspectives, weaving them into the fabric of our nation, and making sure everybody feels like they're being heard, they're being given a fair shake. Because at the end of the day, isn't that what the country is about? Isn't that what every human being wants, right? I'll go to Houston, right? Most diversity in the United States by virtue of being closest to 25% Anglo, 25% African American, 25% Latino, and 25% rest of the world. So in many ways, Houston is a microcosm of the United States, and it's what America will look like in the next years and decades. So in some ways, we've got to get it right here in Houston, because this is an experiment that will repeat itself across the state, across the country. And you do that by building bridges, by connecting communities, making sure we understand each other, because at the end of the day, we're all in this together. We either get it right and we rise with a rising tide, or we all sink. The option is not pitting one against the other. It's not us versus them. It is what can we do together.
In the broader sense, in the most idyllic sense, really, we have to recognize that every single human being has value and purpose, and that we can really learn from each other. But I think it's fair to say that we as a society continue to fail at this all the time. And I think present day, as we look at where we've come in the state of our country, we're at one of the greatest divides that we've ever seen. And how do we bring that together? Well, it takes each of us individually. I can only speak to my experiences personally in the career that I'm in. As a storyteller and filmmaker, I can't judge people, because if I do, it's a detriment to what I'm trying to tell, which is truthful and honest stories. So when I interview film subjects, I can't come in with judgment. When I write a screenplay and I'm trying to develop a character, I can't judge them, because if I do, it feels dishonest. It doesn't feel truthful to the character, and it doesn't make audiences want to connect to them either. So I took that same principle and I apply that to my life. When I am in my everyday life, I go out there trying, and my hopes is trying to always not judge people, but really be open and try to understand where they're coming from, and really have an open dialogue and discussion of, oh, it's a different culture, it's a different religion. Tell me about it. I want to learn. I think we sometimes as society forget to ask why. Let me learn from you. Let me ask you questions. We come a lot of times from a place of, well, I know, but how much do we really know?
As poet Amanda Gorman reminded us earlier this week, it is not about the blade, it is about the bridge. And in so many ways, the promise of life and liberty and pursuit of happiness is something that has to be done in community where we welcome and we don't foment hate. And so when I think about what it is that we need to do and understand to be able to move forward as a community and in unity, it is to understand that the recognition of my existence, the celebration of my existence and my dignity doesn't mean the destruction of yours. And in many ways, I think that that valuing dignity, valuing the very essence of who we are, not because not about whether or not we treat each other the same, but that we treat every single person with a sense of dignity, and the recognition that, as Sanjay was talking about, those who are coming to our borders now are coming for the same reason that people have come to our borders for centuries, which is they are trying to actually pursue life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. They are trying to survive in the same way that I think all of us are, and to understand that in a time of multiple viruses, where we are seeing not only the ways in which we've had an X-ray of how the bones of our democracy are broken through COVID, we are seeing that also through systemic racism, oppression, what's the ways in which people actually haven't had the opportunity to be their full selves. And then we're also seeing the virus of disinformation and hate. where the idea is that every battle, every conversation we're having is one that seems to be steeped in politics or in hate as opposed to in humanity. And I think in so many ways, our challenge right now is to figure out how it is that we can recognize the commonalities in all of our religions, in our faiths, in what it is that we are bringing to America. And I think that's something that, as just one person who grew up here, I've learned a lot about by actually spending time. In the past couple of years, I've served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and I've served with people who have very different views than I do. And part of what I've learned is the ways in which those values, particularly as we like to share them with the world, are very much the same. And so that's the place that I think we need to start from, to understand that the tools we should be using are the ones that build bridges and are not blades.
The United States just elected not only its first woman vice president, but also its first Indian American vice president. She is one of a reported 2.7 million Indian Americans. What strategies do you think could work best in integrating those Indian Americans into American life? And what might stand in their way?
So let me start by saying that the 2.7 Indian Americans are not them. They are we. They are Americans. They have come here, and many like me are born here. And what stands in our way, where in many ways, as Sanjay just spoke about, we see Indian Americans, we see people of all different racial, ethnic, religious backgrounds participating in civic life of our nation, from school boards to transportation boards to writing postcards, to being able to stand outside and make sure that people have the ability to exercise their right to vote, their right to be able to live and prosper here. In all of those different ways, I think they are showing what we have known for a long time, which is that we are Americans and we are choosing to act as part of the American community in all the ways that I think a democracy, that strengthen democracy and what a democracy is here to allow for. So I think in so many ways, what stands in our way, and I speak not only for Indian Americans, but so many Black and Brown communities around the country, is this idea that the very exercise of the right to vote, the very exercise of being part of this democracy, is somehow being questioned by those who say that Black and Brown Americans are not American, or that somehow or another they want to go back to a time in which the glorious founding of this country, as some have put it, where America was assumed by them to be a place for white Americans, and that's just not the case. And as Houston and as communities in every part of this country, in every state, have shown, America is a place where there are so many who bring these different cultural identities, who bring these different racial and ethnic identities, and have made it part of we. And so I think the point here is that there isn't a them, there is a we. And as we move forward, the way in which we do that in the strongest way is to make sure the we is as big and as bold and as free as it possibly can be.
We need to all help each other, support each other, champion each other. When one of us succeeds, we all succeed. When you see someone that looks a lot like you succeeding out in the world, you think, well, maybe I can do that too. Anything is possible. So the greatest gift I think we can give to each other is creating a model of success, because at some point, somebody can be inspired by that and in turn think, well, I can succeed and do something even greater. That is my hope. When I look around and I look at the Indian community, I am so proud when someone succeeds, because I know somebody is being inspired by them to do something similar or even better. And so my hope is that we can all start creating these models of success and start opening those doors a little wider so we can all have an opportunity and all have a seat at that table to be able to succeed.
And I don't think this is unique to the Indian American community, but before I get there, yeah, incredibly proud moment. Vice President Kamala Harris speaks of walking on a beach with her granddad when she was young. My parents and my grandparents lived 100 yards from that beach. So to be sitting here and watching her get sworn in was pretty moving. But going back to, this is not unique to the Indian American community. Any recent immigrant, the first generation that comes here, is rightfully focused on their family, their children, their education, getting their degree, getting a job, their profession, their business, you name it. And as the community matures, they get a lot more involved with the civic political landscape. And I would almost argue that the Indian American community is as engaged as any other diaspora community, if not more. One would just need to look at what's happening in the business world, what's happening in the technology space. Look at the number of leaders in the Biden administration that are of Indian American origin, frankly, some other hyphenated American origin. It's something that evolves over time. I don't think there's a lot that stands between people getting engaged. It is the willingness and the need or the want that they might have. I keep talking about this. Civic engagement is what defines me. If I just had to do my job and not be engaged in civic life, I would probably go crazy. But not everybody is that way, right? But I'll say there is one unintended consequence of the last 4 years. It's given every American a desire to be more involved in civic life, more involved in politics. And frankly, for probably the first time in a long time, none of us are taking our democracy for granted. And that applies to the 2.7 million Indian Americans, as it should to 330 million Americans. Because at that point in time, when it comes to our democracy and our civic life, it is not unique to Indian American. It should be something that any and all Americans care about.